My guest this time is Bonner Cohen. He's a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. He's joined us a number of times to talk about issues related to the business of the Department of the Interior, most specifically last year's major decisions related to national monuments. But today we want to get an even broader picture as we look at the two-year tenure of outgoing Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke. What are the hits? What are the failures? And what should President Trump be looking for in a successor? And Bonner, thanks very much for being with us. Happy New Year.
Thank you very much for having me.
What kind of grade do you give Secretary Zinke? I remember when we were talking specifically about the monuments, you liked what he did but thought he should have done more. In general, when it comes to his handling of policy as it relates to public land, what kind of grade do you give him?
Overall, I would give him about a C+. It being a new year, let's be generous, B-. There were some things which I think he did very well. In other areas, I think much more should have been forthcoming. As to what he did well, in keeping with President Trump's policy to make the United States the world's greatest energy producer, he opened up more areas on public lands for oil, gas, and coal exploration. This is excellent because it now means that the United States is the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. We have overtaken Russia in natural gas production, and we have overtaken both Russia and Saudi Arabia in oil production. Some of that is done on private land, but some of it is being done on public land, and that is the purview of the Interior Department, and Interior Secretary Zinke did a very fine job on that. I would also give him fairly high marks on what he did with respect to shrinking national monuments. These things were gigantic. Over decades and decades, what was originally designed to protect sacred and cultural sites of Native Americans, it simply became a political grab bag and an opportunity for the government to go out and lock up more and more land. And the Trump administration cut this back. In fact, they cut it back a little more than Secretary Zinke was willing to do. But fortunately, in this case, the White House was running the show. Now, where I think he fell short is that Zinke is wed to the whole idea of government ownership of land. He opposes the transfer of these millions and millions and millions of acres of land, primarily in the West, either to the private sector or to the states in which those lands are located, to dispose of and manage as they see fit. As a result thereof, we have this gigantic bureaucracy called the Bureau of Land Management, which oversees over 250 million acres of land across the country. Those of us who live back here in the East may find that a little hard to believe because most of our land is in private hands. Not so in the West, where in states like Nevada, 87% of the land is owned by the federal government, 63% in places like Idaho and Utah. And that puts enormous strains on local rural communities because they have no tax base. They can't spend public funds on schools, infrastructure, roads, bridges, because those public funds have to come from private property taxes, and there's practically no private property in those places. So I would give him a very low grade on that.
Does the Zinke example suggest to you that Republicans have gotten so used to the idea of the federal government owning this land that they're not as compelled to try and pursue the policies you just mentioned of returning it either to the states or to private hands?
Yes, I'm afraid some of them have. A lot of Republicans, particularly those not from the West, don't really have an understanding of the issue because that problem doesn't exist. It's more or less east of the Mississippi River. But others, I think there are voices that said, look, let's take a fresh look at this. And among the the candidates who are being reviewed by the White House, there are some people who I think would take a fresh look at this and say, listen, taxpayers' money can be spent a lot more intelligent ways than funding a giant bureaucracy to manage 250 million acres of land.
We're talking with Bonner Cohen of the National Center for Public Policy Research. And Bonner, you mentioned that there were some folks under consideration who you think would head more in that direction. Who are some of those folks, and do you have any favorites?
Here's a list for you, okay?
Yeah.
Perry Pinley, president of the Mountain States Legal Foundation, served in the Reagan administration, excellent man. David Bernhardt, who is the number 2 man at the Department of Interior, excellent. Congressman Raul Labrador of Idaho. Congressman Steve Pierce of New Mexico, Congressman Tom McClintock of California, Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona, and former Congresswoman Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming. All of those people, I think, would be excellent and would bring a breath of fresh air to the gigantic bureaucracy that is the Department of Interior.
Sounds like you're pretty confident that somebody of that mindset is going to be the next Interior Secretary, or at least the next nominee.
I certainly hope so. There are also some bad actors out there I would not like to see, but we could always hope for the best.
We'll be watching. Major nominees forthcoming in a couple different cabinet departments, including the Pentagon, as well as
exactly right.
Interior. So a lot of personnel fights and debates and intrigue to come. Bonner, again, Happy New Year. Thanks very much for your time today.
Well, Happy New Year to you, and thank you very much for having me.
Bonner Cohen is a senior fellow at the National Center for Public Policy Research. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.